Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Gibney, and as the Director of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Elizabeth Colson Lecture. Last year, I chaired this lecture from my home. This year, I'm chairing it from my office. Next year, I hope to be back in front of an in-person audience at Oxford, but who knows what the next year will hold for us all. Let me start with a few words about the woman after whom this lecture is named. Elizabeth Colson, who passed away in 2016, aged 99, was an esteemed anthropologist based at the University of California at Berkeley. In a lengthy academic career that took her from studying World War II Japanese relocation camps in Arizona to the long-term effects of displacement in modern-day Zambia, Elizabeth Colson researched in intricate detail the social effects of resettlement and dislocation. The work for which she is perhaps best known is her decades-long study of almost 60,000 Gwembe Tongan people living in the Gwembe Valley in Zambia and Zimbabwe, who were forced to relocate to make way for a dam on the Zambezi River. The 1971 book of this study, the social consequences of resettlement, is a unique and powerful contribution to understanding the lasting communal consequences of displacement. In addition to her direct research contribution, Elizabeth Colson was also a key supporter of the Refugee Studies Centre, particularly in its fragile early years under the directorship of Barbara Harold Bond. This annual lecture, then, is thus an ongoing tribute to one of the true pioneers of the academic field of forced migration. Now, since 1996, many esteemed academics have given this lecture, including Saskia Sassen, James Scott, Lisa Malky, and last year, Laura Hammond. Tonight's Colson lecture, the 26th, will be given by another well-respected scholar, Professor Heath Cabot. Professor Cabot, like Elizabeth Colson herself, is an anthropologist from the US. However, in contrast to Elizabeth Colson, her work has primarily focused on communities of people in Europe and in Greece in particular. Professor Cabot is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. Over the last decade, she has engaged in highly original and thoughtful academic discussions of issues concerning refugees, citizenship, solidarity, and humanitarianism. Her well-received book, On the Doorstep of Europe, Asylum and Citizenship in Greece, is a beautifully written and subtle work that, in the words of one of its reviewers, constitutes an ethnographic tour de force that combines anthropological theory with Greek tragedy to illuminate the practical ethics of contemporary citizenship. In a number of important articles, Professor Cabot has also shed light on some key issues relating to refugees: the question of voice and representation, the refugee research industry, and the calculations and practices of NGOs, and done so by drawing upon rich ethnographic material. Despite being still at a relatively early stage of her career, Professor Cabot has shown herself to be an exciting and original scholar, and a very deserving and popular choice for this afternoon's lecture. Now, before I hand over to her to speak, let me say that there will be a question and answer session with the speaker at the end of this talk. You can submit written questions as soon as the talk begins through the Q&A button on your screen. And as I hope to get through as many of these questions as we can, please keep your questions as succinct as possible. But now let me pass over to Professor Cabot to speak on the afterlives of return and the limits of refugee protection.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled and I would say also humbled to be here, let's say, well, dialing in from Pittsburgh with a background of Athens. That's where I like to be spiritually right now. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I want to thank the Refugee Studies Center for the invitation, and particularly Tom Scott Smith and Matt Gibney, who I think were really instrumental in that. So I have this long-term investment in Greece as an anthropologist, and specifically in the relationships and networks that I've built there over time. And over the past few years, I've mostly been writing about the disorientation that I've felt as my field area has become a site for unprecedented numbers of refugee arrivals. This was in 2015 and 16, which sparked an explosion in humanitarian interventions in Greece and a concomitant boom in scholarship. My concern has been with how crisis temporalities and a tendency toward what I've called crisis chasing among researchers privileges spectacular aspects of crossing and arrival in engagements with mobile people, and often erases more entrenched forms of exclusion and longer-term struggles for inclusion. Crisis mentalities can also have an exoticizing and othering approach to mobile people as particular objects, let's say, of study, of investment, often monetary, and intervention. And we can even see this in the ongoing refugee studies field itself, or migration studies field itself. And so I've come to advocate for attention to slow as opposed to spectacular violence, an interest in more hidden or perhaps normalized forms of struggle, complexity of feeling, even joy, over a focus on suffering, and an attention to those in positions of power in migration regimes over a default focus on the migrant or refugee. And I've also changed my research focus, moving away from cross-border mobilities as such to broader issues related to belonging, citizenship, and really the core questions of what makes it possible for people to flourish, and what gets in the way of that flourishing. Right now, I'm writing a book about mixed groups of care seekers and caregivers in grassroots healthcare initiatives in Greece. And these include recent arrivals, those seeking refuge, as well as sans-papiers, long-term residents of Greece, as well as Greek nationals. And it's not just border crossers and marginalized Greeks who seek care at these sites. People who perhaps never saw themselves as vulnerable or in need also come to these extra state venues to cobble together care and treatment. Throughout all of these shifts in my relationship with research in Greece, I was always in close contact with my friend and research interlocutor, Hussein. He was a recognized refugee in Greece since 1999, and I first met him in 2006 when I was still a graduate student. He was working as an interpreter at an NGO where I focused much of my research for my dissertation and later book. And over the years, we became close friends through various changes in our own lives. For me, PhD, partnering up, job transitions, moves. For him, shifts in his work, periods of instability, and the transition from middle to old age. He was always quite fatherly, a little bit flirtatious, with a piercing intelligence and humor. And he was always so much more than just an ethnographic muse. He was always a meaning maker alongside me in my work, a kind of touchstone. When taking stock of all the losses and challenges of this past pandemic year, one of the most grievous of them for me personally was Hussein's death. In the summer of 2018, he was diagnosed with a catastrophic illness. In January of 2020, he made the decision to go back to Sudan after 20 years in Greece. And last July, he died after ups and downs in his treatment, a sharp decline in his well-being, and periods of great pain. The day of his death, I received a message from a relative of his stating that he'd passed away that morning and had been buried in the family cemetery in Khartoum. I'd been expecting the news, but it still hit me hard. and I undertook the task of notifying some others, primarily our many mutual friends in Greece. Responses to the news of his death and conversations with colleagues and friends expressed loss, but also a faint sense of relief amidst the sadness that he died at home. There's nothing better than a refugee's return to his homeland to die next to his family, expressed one colleague, who also noted the fall of Sudan's dictatorship in the military coup of 2019, which likely contributed to making Hussein's return possible. Such sentiments speak to multiple returns, to homeland, to family, to ground. They offer a kind of closure, dying at home among family after years of exile, and they are an important part of the story. But taken on its own, I think an overly celebratory vision of return also risks neglecting important aspects of Hussein's life, as well as his illness and death. The very idea of return is grounded on a model of origins, of rootedness, and when taken uncritically, can reassert, in Lisa Malki's terms, that national order of things, the idea that people are born into and must belong to a nation state, and otherwise they don't belong or are somehow out of place. While comforting to the living, return implies that Hussein, down to his very matter, had been somehow put back among ancestors and kin where he should have been, and conversely, that through his time in Greece, he'd been out of place. And this is the same logic that marks border crossers as aberrant, exceptional, even threatening. Return, when wedded to the existential points of birth and death, is also grounded on ideas of temporal and spatial linearity, there and back, clear beginning and endpoints, when really lives, like memory, often take shape in fragments, patches, and threads that tangle, unfurl, fray, and loop back. And they have echoes, afterlives. In his book on genetic knowledge, Noah Tamarkin, drawing on historian Saidiya Hartman's work, among others, writes that attention to afterlives highlights loss and remembrances, unexpected openings, and new circulations, disparate kinds of lingering effects. So I want to look beyond the arc of closure embedded in this idea of return and attend instead to some of the afterlives of Hussein's return that continue to resonate, disquiet, and even acquire new vitality in the present. And in turn, I return to him, as I have over the years, revisiting him in this time of great collective loss. I pour some libations into the dust, so to speak, to call him up again. I don't entirely want to let him rest. In troubling a more idealized vision of refugee return, I do not question the importance of Hussein's return to Sudan for him and for family and friends. But having been beside him for some key moments in his illness, I also know that his return was not just a desire on his part, though it was. It was also a necessity, owing to failures and deficits in protection, rights, and care, despite his formal recognition as a refugee and the networks that he had achieved over his years in Greece. And so going home was from this perspective as ambivalent as his death. Now, in discussing Hussein for this talk, I'm doing some things I'm quite ambivalent about and which are even in tension, I would say, with aspects of my current research approach, which I outlined earlier. I'm focusing on a refugee interlocutor and his experiences of struggle and survival. I also focus in part on his suffering, if not the suffering of trauma and persecution, then the pain of aging and illness and forms of systemic, if not spectacular, violence. Now, he was a little bit of an intellectual snob, I will say, in the best possible way. And I'm quite convinced that he would have been pleased to feature in a talk at Oxford. And it's funny, I received texts from a couple of mutual friends yesterday and today saying that he would be just tickled to be featured. So I feel good about that. And I have received the permission and support of close family members of his in my decision to talk about him today. But it's still ambivalent. And even as I'm speaking, I remain unsure about the decision, which I think is a perfectly appropriate place to be for talking about such a topic. But since this is a lecture named in honor of the ethnographer Elizabeth Colson, I also can't think of a better platform to draw on insights from sustained attention over time, mutual investment, intimacy, and care, such as that which my friendship with Hussein allowed, as opposed to a snapshot drop-in version of that. Now, I would be the first to note the problematic, even exploitative nature of anthropology's past and present. Still, at their very best, ethnographic engagements go far beyond mere research and enter the terrain of love. I love Hussein, and I know many ethnographers would also recognize the crucial role of love in our work. But these kinds of long-term mutual investments carry one into the hard but often uncelebrated, ordinary places, often neglected by certain refugee-related tropes with a focus on persecution and flight, the dangers of border crossing, or spaces of abjection or encampment. Aging, illness, and death are deeply painful, always extraordinary, but in a way also deeply commonplace, and thus often ignored. In scholarship at least. Focusing on a particular life and death bears the risk of isolating a person from wider social processes, making it sort of all about the individual and their experience. But when embedded in larger contexts, this approach can also reveal a whole lot about larger systems and their failures. Looking at what Hussein built and how he struggled underlines limits of refugee protection and the unstable foundations of belonging more broadly. Illness and dying in contexts of displacement speak to lasting elements of strangerhood that are intensified through debility. As Yasmin Gunaratnam writes in her study of migrant illness and dying in the UK, bodily vulnerability is unevenly fabricated, distributed, and defended against. As such, she goes on, to feel the pull of a distant home at the end of life is not the same vulnerability that we all face of not knowing what the future holds. So in other words, we all die, but owing to systems and inequalities much greater than individual lives and bodies, we do not all have the same possibility to die well or with dignity. So now I'm going to switch to my discussion, but I had a couple of notes I wanted to make at the outset. First of all, I'm not confirming or triangulating the material that I am presenting you with today. I'm going on what I experienced and witnessed myself with Hussein, and also what he told me. I didn't set out to conduct systematic research on his illness. And so I think that's the most appropriate way to proceed. But I'm also saying this because I think it's safe to assume that there are probably some very important things he didn't share with me, or that he shared things with me for me, right? That maybe looked differently to the way he communicated with others. And so I say this partially because I know some of his family and friends are tuning in right now. Thank you. Or maybe watching later. So this is a note to them as well. Versions may be different, more or less authoritative, and this is my version. I also just wanted to take a moment. I will not show many images today, but I don't want him to just be this anonymous person that you're hearing about. And I chose these 3 pictures because they capture different aspects of him, all in his moments of health. So this is shortly after I met him, winter 2017, winter 2007, at work, very distinguished, but also looking like he could crack a joke at some point, which he probably would. And he did crack a joke over here for sure. I just know that image. He must have said something sassy, maybe just a little bit naughty, and made me crack up. But we also have him over here. This is at a book presentation that I did in 2015, which he kindly agreed to speak at. And I think he occupies that podium as if he owns it. So keep these in your mind as I'm talking about him. Thank you. Okay. So Hussein came to Europe with his nephew in 1999, and his nephew continued on to the Netherlands while Hussein chose to remain in Greece. I'd heard him recount many times over the years how he'd known Greeks in Sudan. There was a large Greek population there when he was growing up, and he found them warm, like the weather. And Greece reminded him of home for its warmth and chaos. And over the years, he would often display the sense of sort of frustration and intimacy and even kinship with Greece and Greeks, a kind of shared intimacy between global and European Souths and all the sort of stereotypes that also goes along with that. Now, Hussein had achieved the holy grail for most everyone I've talked to in Greece's asylum system: formal recognition as a refugee. His asylum claim had gone swiftly, and he didn't have to go through the years of limbo that many have experienced and continue to experience in the asylum system. And at that time, I've met people who'd been in the system for as long as 10 years without a response to their case. This was early 2000s. He had all the formal privileges of refugee status: access to the public health system, documents to stay, and documents with which to travel, though he could never, of course, formally relocate in Europe. And he even had a small monthly stipend. He also assembled a respected network of people who respected and supported him. As he'd readily admit, it didn't hurt that he was well-educated, immensely articulate, with excellent British accented English, and a professorial vibe and look, which you got to see. He emphasized that his intellectual and social capital were crucial to making him and his story compelling in his asylum hearing. Specifically, the fact that he could give his account in English without relying on an interpreter and also convey appropriate forms of emotion. He'd also emerged as a kind of model refugee, let's say, in Greek asylum advocacy networks in the 2000s. And he served regularly as a refugee representative at events in Greece and elsewhere in Europe. And he even featured in an advertising campaign for the UNHCR, which I've written about in the article on Voices that I believe Matt Gibney referenced earlier. But despite his recognized refuginess, his stipend was never enough to live on, and he always had to cobble together a living situation. He faced housing insecurity numerous times over the years. Unlike a great many interpreters in Greece at that time who had language knowledge but not formal training, now there are much more rigorous standards for interpreters in Greece. Hussein had worked as a professional interpreter for an oil company in Saudi Arabia years before coming to Greece, translating between Arabic and English. But his job as an NGO interpreter was only part-time and didn't always get him by, let's say. So his access to housing and everyday forms of stability, when he did have them, did not emerge from regulatory or legal aspects, formal rights, protections, and services, but primarily from the social infrastructures. And even though I was told by mutual Sudanese acquaintances that owing to his class and educational background, as well as some of the racial politics in the Sudanese community in Greece, he was a little bit set apart socially, as well as his age. But he would still eat multiple meals a week at various Sudanese restaurants or social clubs, which are both informal and formal venues. And he sometimes slept at these places as well, which would get him through times of housing insecurity. This was not just an issue of survival, though. Many of others, men like himself. He'd also built professional networks in both and advocacy spheres and elsewhere. And about 10 years ago, he got a part-time gig at a hotel in an affluent suburb of Athens that an acquaintance had helped him get. He was also given a room there, which he said was because his boss was kind. It was out of his boss's kindness and the fact that his boss was a good man. And he mentioned many times over the years how much he valued the independence and privacy that this work and housing arrangement offered. He also had cultivated strong relationships with a wonderful network of Christian activists who'd been in Greece since the 1990s with their kindness and dignity by them. At their ministry, you could get a shower, you could get a warm meal, wash your clothes. He often spent Christmas with the head of the ministry and met a number of other close friends through them. He also regularly attended Bible study for the intellectual stimulation and the sociality it promised, as well as the opportunity to argue and debate, which he was always very good at. There were also kinship networks, and throughout his time in Greece, he remained in close contact with siblings and extended family, and was even able to see his son occasionally when he was able to come to Europe. But these aspects of Hussein's life, I'm going to leave opaque because I can't speak to them directly, and it's really not my place to. Anyway, my point here is probably not particularly surprising for many of you. Having achieved the Holy Grail refugee status, legal recognition in itself did not grant Hussein a livable life. He had to do an awful lot of work to cobble one together. There was never any clear moment when he arrived. Belonging, as Nikhil Anand writes in his study of citizenship and water infrastructures in Mumbai, is not an event that's turned on and off like a switch, nor can it be secured through formal recognitions. Instead, it's assembled actively by people themselves in often patchwork ways. And if I can also draw on Catherine Bestman's work, her book, Making Refuge, she shows that refuge is never some place you arrive at, but that it's constantly processually made, and it always sort of falls apart as the edges as well. And I would say that this is particularly the case in Greece, where under austerity policies that actively targeted the social state, key ways of getting by for both Greek nationals and long-term residents were rerouted to an ever more diverse array of actors, institutions, and networks. Hussein had assembled a powerful set of infrastructures, economic, social, legal, that facilitated access to things crucial for his survival. But these were unstable as they were essential. Hussein's capacity to get by was perhaps, like all of us, but certainly for displaced men in Greece, directly dependent on his capacity to engage in productive forms of labor. And this supplemented and was supplemented by his social networks. He'd worked in fishing and done agricultural work when he first arrived in Greece, even though he was already in his mid to late 50s at that time. But the physical labor that so many migrant men rely on was increasingly unavailable to him. And I also think he had a quiet determination to make use of his considerable intellectual and social gifts, hence his work as an interpreter and at the front desk of the hotel. But the economic downturn in Greece and austerity vastly impacted Greek citizens as well as long-term residents like Hussein. And during the 2010s, there was mass unemployment reaching 26% at one point, general unemployment, 40-something% youth unemployment, pension cuts of 30 to 50%, taxes on necessities, privatization of public services, and huge cuts in the public sector. Those are just sort of brief highlights of austerity in Greece. And so many began to awaken to the fact that neither work nor even citizenship status, like being Greek, guaranteed that one could survive, let alone flourish, if it ever had. Hussein's boss, himself near retirement age and facing economic difficulties, and watching the dream of his retirement fade slowly away, decided to sell the hotel to a buyer who was much less concerned about his employees, and Hussein had to leave. At this point, his friends from the church, through their ministry, provided him housing in a shared apartment with another man. And while he noted that he was grateful, he found this experience difficult. His housemate was particularly annoying to him for the relationships of dependency that he cultivated. Hussein told me this one day. He goes to the mosque and the church as a way to ingratiate himself to both, to increase his chances of getting assistance. Hussein did not approve. You can't just try to become dependent. Can you imagine? To have dependency as your goal in life. But in losing his access to wage labor, Hussein was also increasingly positioned, if unwillingly, in relations of dependency that he found so difficult. And this was also at a time when incidences of racialized violence spiked in Greece, and he suffered more forms of everyday racism and even a number of assaults. In 2016, though, the increasing arrivals of border crossers in Greece created a boom in the humanitarian and migration management sectors and a high demand for skilled interpreters. And so Hussein went back to work, a way out of those relations of dependency that had made him so uncomfortable. He was 73 at that time, well beyond the retirement age, but he took a full-time job with the NGO where I'd met him a decade before, which also this time around included housing. He was first sent to work on the island of Leros in late summer 2016, then to Chios in winter 2017, where he developed a wonderful friendship with the Greek lawyer he was working with. But during this time, he was also harassed by neo-Nazis who have a strong presence on the island. During the weeks he would get off, we would meet in Athens. He always emphasized his own position of relative security with respect to recent arrivals, and in many cases, Greek nationals navigating poverty. We were discussing one day the grassroots healthcare initiatives where I was doing fieldwork, and he explained that he'd only sought care at them a couple of times, though he admired them very much, particularly their commitment to only taking donations in kind, not money. But, he noted approvingly, they only help those who don't have access to the healthcare system. He, as a recognized refugee, did, unlike sans-papiers and uninsured Greek nationals. During those years of overlapping crises in austerity Greece, the rights and entitlements of membership became increasingly confused, producing what I've written about elsewhere as a context of humanitarian citizenship. Citizens, more recent arrivals, and longer-term residents alike across these very diverse categories of legal status increasingly relied not so much on state and public services, but on diffuse and unstable infrastructures of humanitarian support. These were not just initiatives focused on refugee reception. The Greek economic crisis had increasingly been coded as a humanitarian crisis, anthropistiki krisi, and sparked a panoply of extra state initiatives, NGO, charitable, grassroots, and otherwise, that help people struggling with poverty, irrespective of national background, including so-called regular Greeks. But particularly in 2015-16, during the worst or most intense moments of the refugee crisis, let's say, the humanitarian sector became a crucial employment venue for Greek nationals and residents of migrant and refugee backgrounds like Hussein. For instance, one of my close interlocutors for my current book project, and also a friend, a Greek man with no previous experience in the humanitarian field, had only one job since 2011, an 8-month temporary contract at a refugee camp. As livelihoods in Greece became more precarious, they also became increasingly dependent on this refugee industry. The humanitarian sector, while built on the dependencies of others, thus made Hussein less dependent, at least for a time. In 2017, he was sent to the island of Lesbos, just 5 kilometers from Turkey. Hussein went to work in what he described as the end of the world, Moria, the refugee camp that burned to the ground this past September, renowned for its overcrowding, poor sanitation, and unspeakable conditions. Hussein had never, in all the years I'd known him, shown himself to be worn down by anything emotionally, but it was almost as if he couldn't manage this work, even as it was necessary for his own precarious security and independence. He was still stuck between those poles of work or dependency, neither of which presented stable livelihoods, particularly for someone in their mid-70s and who, unbeknownst to him at the time, was under the shadow of an impending illness. I spend a couple weeks every year that I can, non-pandemic years, teaching at the summer school on cultures, migrations, and borders hosted by the University of the Aegean on Lesbos. Highly recommend it when it's back, hopefully next summer. In 2018, when Hussein was also on Lesbos, this was a great chance for us to connect. He agreed to give a talk to the summer school, along with his lawyer friend who'd also been transferred with him there. And as thrilled as I was to see him and to introduce him to close friends and colleagues, I was also worried. He'd always been extremely thin, but he'd become downright frail. And a colleague visiting the summer school that year, a medical anthropologist who spent years working with people dealing with various kinds of illness, asked me outright if he was sick. The comment proved prescient. On the day I was scheduled to leave the island to return to Athens, Hussein canceled the plans we had made to say goodbye. He'd been moving a sofa or chair or something in his room when he felt a sudden sharp pain in his shoulder. He needed to rest. His condition worsened over the next weeks. A trip to the hospital showing that he had multiple broken bones, including his collarbone and his ribs. So his colleagues arranged for transport back to Athens. There, a close friend from the church housed him and, incapacitated as he was, got him to the hospital for an examination. Now, without getting into the details of his illness, he was diagnosed with a form of cancer that, when it progresses, can cause a weakening of the bones. And Hussein's bones breaking spontaneously like this meant that it had already become very severe. And he was also well acquainted with this form of cancer since a close family member had died of it. Despite the urgency of his condition, over the next few weeks, after I had returned to the US for the academic year, he told me that he was still waiting to begin treatment. And by that winter, late fall, winter, Hussein had decided to go to Amsterdam to stay with the nephew who he'd arrived in Greece with years ago, and to see if he could get treated there. And I met up with him when I visited Amsterdam in January of 2019. He insisted on meeting out of the house, explaining that it would do him good to get out. But when he and his nephew arrived, he told me that he'd felt a bone break as they were walking out the door. So we sat in a restaurant, Hussein dressed in a suit jacket with a cane that made him look even more dapper than usual, but he was hunched over in pain. A couple of days later, I brought a copy of My Fair Lady with me across town to the comfortable multi-room apartment where his nephew lived. Hussein was, like me, a sucker for musicals. He was laid out on a bed in the living room where he could watch television easily. And after we watched the film, his nephew made us a late afternoon meal of delicious curried chicken, and we ate together. Hussein spoke with clear admiration of his cooking and ate with a gusto I'd never seen him eat with before. Ever since I'd known him, he ate like a bird. He would always say, I don't need to eat a lot. He hates cooking for himself. I prefer a cigarette. But this was food he liked, consumed with friends and family. Hussein and his nephew both expressed concern and frustration because they'd been waiting for over a month for him to see the doctor. He apparently needed to have a local primary care doctor in order to see a specialist, and he was waiting for that initial appointment. I nonetheless left Amsterdam feeling like he was in good hands. A few weeks later, though, Hussein collapsed and was brought into emergency care. Tests showed that the cancer had worsened, and he was reaching the point of kidney failure. He spent a few weeks in the hospital on a drip until he was stabilized, and his son got leave from work and came to visit him. Hussein told me that he expected that this emergency would accelerate the treatment, but when he was released from the hospital, he called me, much renewed from his hospital stay, to tell me that he'd gotten an appointment with a renowned expert on the kind of cancer he had. Guess where? In Greece. And that he had to receive his treatment there since that's where he had his refugee status. And he laughed when he told me this, knowing that I would appreciate the horrible irony and the bureaucratic weirdness of this. The doctor in Amsterdam arranged with the doctor in Greece for Hussein to begin treatment as soon as possible. And it reminded us both of Dublin cases from the mid to late 2000s, back when asylum seekers used to be returned to Greece regularly from sites in the European North. And so Hussein was essentially returned to Greece by the very health system that had drawn him to the Netherlands. And ironically, he also accessed the Greek health system via the health system in the Netherlands. But with his return to Greece, he was also sent away from family, a warm home, care, company, and food that he liked, any one of which could make all the difference for someone facing a catastrophic illness. I met up with Hussein a few months later upon my return to Athens in May 2019, and he was doing much better. After a very difficult spring, he'd completed a number of rounds of chemo, and it seemed finally to be having a positive effect. His bones had healed, and he was mobile again. He'd rented a one-room basement apartment, a shortish walk from Victoria Square, near a Sudanese restaurant where he managed to go eat once a day. He could afford the rent on his stipend and with a bit of help from family and friends. He expressed pride that he had some personal space, dark and really damp as it was, during a particularly rainy and cold early summer. He had some energy to go out as well, and we went for coffee as we used to, meeting in the city center, and we went shopping together for sandals and clothing for the upcoming summer. We also went back to talking about my own problems and doubts, and he made me laugh about them as usual. I also started a ritual of going with him to chemotherapy and going to eat together afterward. He was very pleased with his doctor, who he emphasized treated him courteously always and provided him with excellent care. "You'd never even know it's Greece," he joked. He was particularly pleased, she said, at how I just go in and they let me go right up in front of all of the other people waiting. And they always referred to him as Sir or Mr. Curios. The very first time we went together to the hospital, his excellent access was on display. He showed a note from his doctor to the people at the front desk who let him jump the queue. And he walked right up into his doctor's office in the oncology section, passing a long line of people in the hallway, some with the patchy hair of outpatient chemotherapy patients, some with family, some of their own. His doctor was an attractive woman about my age or younger, and she looked at me and commented on how many friends he has. I was not the first to accompany him. She delivered to him the good news that according to his latest test, the chemotherapy was making significant inroads. I asked her how I could be of help while I was around, and she urged me to help him eat. She scolded him kindly because she knew he hadn't been eating. He needs to eat all food groups every day, she emphasized, and he nodded reluctantly. Now, Hussein's experience of care at the hospital, an experience of dignity, let's say, was indeed quite remarkable, I must say, compared to the uneven experiences I've had myself with the public health system in Greece and the accounts of a great many others. And I'm not trying to disparage the public health system in Greece, but let's just say that it's not a service mentality. And access to healthcare for migrants and asylum seekers in Greece is the topic for a much, much longer conversation. But suffice it to say that formally registered asylum seekers, refugees, and long-term residents do have access to the public system, as Hussein had noted. Though ease of access and quality of care are always a question mark. And I will note that the current government has massively rolled back accessibility for migrants in Greece. But Hussein's care went beyond mere entitlement. He even seemed to be a little bit puzzled, thinking that he almost was getting special treatment. And I described his treatment to an acquaintance of mine who noted that his doctor must also be very powerful with good contacts in the hospital. And I just think this is interesting because there's a common understanding of the importance of networks in Greece that also shapes care seeking and care delivery perhaps as well. And that's the idea that a right on its own is not enough. You have to also have these contacts. After his chemo, we would go to Fish Taverna near the hospital and order grilled sardines, boiled zucchini, and feta. He liked fish as well as spicy things, and he always asked the friendly proprietor for red pepper flakes. The first time we went, he ate gingerly but hungrily, saying that he'd not managed to eat in 3 days. He'd been too tired to go to the Sudanese restaurant. In Hussein's own formulation, his failing appetite made manifest not just his illness, but the increasing isolation that accompanied the illness, despite his excellent care at the hospital. And this was in stark contrast to what I'd witnessed in Amsterdam, where his nephew cooked for him and ate with him, no questions asked. In Greece, Hussein's appetite, and in this sense also his bodily health and strength, depended on others coming to his apartment to eat with him, or on his own energy to go out. Family and friendship networks were not just crucial to his appetite, but to his care more broadly. A few weeks later, he called me from the largest hospital in Athens, Evangelismos, which is really basically in the city center. He'd fainted at the Sudanese restaurants, and some of his I'm sorry. He fainted at the Sudanese restaurant, and some of his friends had brought him to the hospital, and he'd been admitted. So I went over, bringing clean sheets, which are often in short supply at Greek public hospitals, reading material, and upon his request, some juice and snacks. He could not even look at the hospital food, he told me. I arrived to find Hussein on a gurney outside a room, in a long line of occupied gurneys. Patients were literally overflowing into the hallway. He was only one of 2 in the ward who were there alone, without family. The other was a woman from Crete who'd been visiting Athens for work and had gotten ill. But otherwise, it was as if the seaside had come to the hospital. Lawn and beach chairs, coolers, at least 1 or 2 people beside each bed, often chatting, playing cards. So I settled in to accompany Hussein. And we spent a surprisingly pleasant few days. He was there, I think, for almost a week, as he awaited test results and communications with his oncologist. He had an infection, and so he had a fever and a high white blood cell count related to his weakened immune system, not the cancer specifically. During his stay, we joked repeatedly about one particular patient, a very robust-looking man in his early middle age who flirted with the nurses and hung out with other patients walking up and down the hallway, all the while attended to by his aged mother who looked like she could barely sit upright in the chair, but who came every day, her arms weighted down with things for her son and home-cooked food, which was not officially allowed in the hospital. In the meantime, since I was not a family member, I had to justify my access to the hospital every time I entered outside visiting hours until the guards got to know me and I ultimately got a visitor's pass. Are you accompanying someone? Yes, he's alone. I need to be with him. This would always garner a sympathetic nod and a wave. Because joking aside, the congregations of families, the beach chairs, I learned to bring my own, these are not luxuries. Particularly following the major cuts in the public system, including the loss of thousands of hospital personnel. In around 2017, I think 7,000 hospital personnel had left Greece. Family or friends are crucial for taking care of patient needs beyond the twice daily doctor's rounds. To empty the bedpan, help someone to the toilet, bathe them, all of these crucial aspects of care fall to family members most of the time, or for families that can afford it, outside private nurses who come for a fee and whose services are advertised all over the place. And I'm just going to show you one other image. This is actually, I couldn't find an actual business card, but in Greek public hospitals, you'll see these business cards with usually a picture of an attractive young woman saying, Greek exclusive nurses, right? So this one says license to practice, which became very relevant in 2019 when one of these caregivers from Armenia jumped out of a window and died because she was trying to avoid control being caught in the hospital, since a lot of this work is informal. But you get a sense, I think, for how this kind of, this is subcontracted within the hospital, as hospital personnel are not able or don't actually provide all of that care. And here you have, actually, this is not from my stay with Hussein, but this is ambulance transport service. You can rent chairs and televisions if you don't bring a beach chair. So all of these are sort of added values. They're not included in your stay, really. So, okay. I think I've successfully stopped my screen share. I hope someone will let me know if I didn't. Okay, great. Anyway, Hussein didn't need intimate help, let's say, but I arranged his pillows, brought him water, and helped him walk down the hallway to the bathroom. And I also tried my best to be an advocate, asking clarifying questions of the doctor, trying to contact his oncologist, arranging with a surprisingly amiable kitchen staff to bring him rice and tea, which were the only things he could stomach. The people on the floor gossiped about us. Was I his daughter? I was too young to be his wife, surely. But he's dark-skinned, I'm white-skinned. Anyway, we went with the daughter story, but the idea is that I had to be family, right? The assumption was that only family would accompany you like this to the hospital. After a few days, Hussein was moved inside one of the rooms, and he was happy to have a more comfortable bed, but he lamented that he was now in the room with all the other men and their wives and friends and picnics and children. Anyway, he could not get a moment's peace. When he was released from the hospital, he was not able to resume his chemo for a couple of weeks. I went with him one more time for his treatment, which it turned out would be the last time I saw him, as I had to go back for the start of the academic year to the US. Before leaving, though, I brought him a supply of tramadol, an opioid painkiller from one of the grassroots pharmacies where I was doing my research. He had the requisite prescription, but it was sometimes hard to find at the pharmacy that was walkable from his apartment. In the fall of 2019, he told me that his doctor was giving him a break from the chemo, that he was doing pretty well at that point. And he sent me the following message, which I wanted to read. I'm able to spend long times outside the house. I go to the Sudanese restaurants and sit in different parks. I'm thinking of going to the beach. I'm really very happy. He had in the meantime decided to go back to Amsterdam to visit his nephew. He didn't want to be alone in his damp basement anymore. And he stayed in Amsterdam for a few weeks. But upon his return to Athens, literally at the airport, he went to wash his hands in the bathroom and he felt, in his words, 1,000 volts of electricity and a great sound like a crack and a pain you cannot imagine. His arm had broken and it seems his condition had worsened again. After that, whenever we spoke, I noted a change in his tone, a sense of resignation, exhaustion, despair. Still, his networks mobilized. Friends from the NGO worked to fix problems with his pension, which were never actually resolved, and arranged for him to eat lunch every day at a restaurant nearby if he could make it there. Sudanese friends and a friend from the church helped with housing and at-home care. On our calls, I tried my best to buck him up, come up with solutions. Isn't your treatment going well? What if we can find a place for you to live temporarily near the hospital? What about 24-hour care? He told me he'd think about it, but I don't think he ever seriously considered it. He called me in early January 2020, telling me that his son had arrived in Athens. They together had decided that he was going back to Sudan. He could stay with his sister. He emphasized that they had access to private hospitals and great networks, and he would receive good treatment. And he would not be alone. He would be with family. His son and a dear friend from the church brought him to the airport, another bone breaking the morning of his departure, where they undertook a journey with a 10-hour layover in Cairo, but he made it. Over the next few months, we spoke regularly, though our calls became increasingly infrequent and eventually also incoherent. He was staying in his sister's well-appointed house. He'd point out the nice furnishings during our video chats, and he spoke of the nice hospital he went to. He faced an initial difficulty accessing painkillers, which he told me are particularly well regulated in Sudan, so his pain was really very bad when he first got there. But once he got his pain under control, he would occasionally voice a fear of becoming a burden. Relationships of dependency still seemed to bother him, even though he was with family. Still, a hired caregiver came in every day and would bring him outside into the courtyard when his sister and his son were at work. When the pandemic hit last March, he joked that now everyone else was like him, immobile. The last time I spoke to him was in mid-May of last year when his son facilitated a call between us after a great many unanswered texts and calls on WhatsApp and Messenger. Finally, on July 2nd, 2020, I received the message from his nephew in Amsterdam. Hussein passed away this morning, buried 2 hours ago in the family cemetery. And so here I am again, at that return where I began, his being laid to rest among family, having died among family at home. And it does present a kind of peace, a relief from suffering and struggle. But it also leaves disquieting echoes, given all that made Hussein's life in Greece difficult, and his illness and dying even more so. Despite his legal status, his education and linguistic knowledge, and robust social ties, Hussein ultimately did not just choose to return, though he did. He had to return, owing to systems failures far beyond his own failing health, which make it so difficult for so many to live and die with dignity. Lacking the mobility to receive treatment elsewhere in Europe, where family members could help him, Hussein did acquire excellent healthcare at the hospital in Greece. But this could only go so far, owing to a lack of adequate home healthcare and housing, transport, access to his pension, not to mention the cutbacks in the public healthcare system. And before one wants to write this off as just a Greek problem, let's just remember that these anemic social services were a product, a lot of them were a product of austerity, which severely impacted the population at large in Greece. The presumed availability of family and community care is so often leveraged to legitimize cutbacks in public systems, even as we know that family may not have the resources to stand in. And even if not everyone has kinship and social ties, both displaced people and those at home, the idea, at least, is that family is supposed to be there when all else fails. And so systems can fail. Hussein's illness also illustrates what Georgina Ramsey describes as the close tie between protection and the profitability of refugee lives and bodies. These are forms of protection that don't plan on the long term and which make economic independence and the laboring viability of bodies prerequisites for survival, not to mention well-being. Even as someone dealing with aging and debility, Hussein either had to work or enter into relations of what he called dependency in order to just get by. And as his capacity for work dwindled, it eventually became impossible for him to be both independent and not alone. And so his decision to return to Sudan was, of course, about loved ones and being in once familiar places, but it was also a way into relations of care beyond dependency, a way to die with dignity. Now, this term dignity usually grates on me. It sounds really naive, kind of term that politicians throw around in speeches without really knowing what they're talking about. But recently I read Sarah Willen's beautiful book, which argues for attentions to questions of dignity in the study of mobility. A focus on dignity goes beyond taking suffering and abjection as topics of inquiry in themselves, and looks at how people seek ways to live and even flourish, always partially, of course, even in unlivable circumstances. Flourishing, livability, these are, as Willen writes, fundamentally future-oriented and infused with possibility and hope about whatever measure of life remains. But what happens to dignity when the horizon contracts? Hussein showed me that dignity in death is as important as dignity in life. And death, like life, is a form of becoming. It's not an event with a clear telos or endpoint. It's not exceptional to life. Instead, the conditions of one's dying are an accretion of factors that condition the kinds of belonging that one can experience. The spaces of livability and of flourishing that Hussein carved out in Greece during his life were always over and above his access to rights and the connections that he and others forged together in kindness, courtesy, care. And I believe these aspects extended also to the kind of death that he sought, in the embrace of relations and relationships that would make weakness and pain bearable, in which one could remain on some level independent or dignified, yet not alone. Following experiences of displacement across the life course necessitates looking beyond punctuated moments of persecution, flight, arrival, reception, access to asylum, acquisition of refugee status, all those so-called refugee-related issues, to the wider frameworks of rights and care in which we're all embedded, and the core question of what we actually value in our societies. Frailty, aging, illness, and death are in many ways the great equalizers. They afflict all of us who are lucky enough to grow old, but we experience them differently, owing to the systemic, even systematic features that asymmetrically distribute suffering and flourishing, and which go far beyond the singularity of any one life or death. One could argue that we cannot legislate or enforce dignity, but we can work for more systematic, systemic, pervasive forms of kindness. This isn't pity, not charity. This isn't a temporary solution for those who most in need. And kindness isn't just an attitude. It's not just a disposition, but entails bureaucratic, social, institutional, political, economic, and ethical ways of promoting forms of care beyond dependency, and which make dignity possible for everyone in the fullness of their lives and of their deaths. Thank you.
Thank you, Heath, for that marvelous talk.